Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, can I congratulate you on your re-election as Speaker of the House, and could I also put on record my deep thanks to the people of Islington North for electing me again for the 8th time to Parliament, and for their support, and my pledge obviously to represent them on all issues, and that I hope that in this Parliament we begin to see some justice for them, particularly on issues relating to housing and poverty levels that are sadly so rife and serious in much of inner city Britain. This is a debate about international affairs, or at least this section of the Queen's speech is, and I want to pay tribute to my friend, the member for Leeds Central, particularly for the latter part of his speech in the debate earlier on today, in which he pointed out that the issues that are facing the globe, the wars of the future, are going to be largely on resources, are going to be wars about water, are going to be wars about food and about food security. We have to face up to the global inequality that exists, to the widening chasm between the wealth of the minority in the wealthiest countries and the poverty of the majority in the poorest countries of the world. And if we are complaining about refugee flows at the present time, awful as the conditions those people are escaping from are, tragic as the deaths in the Mediterranean, Andaman Sea and elsewhere are, the situation is going to get worse the greater the inequality in the world, particularly on issues of food security and environmental security. And so I think we have to be far more serious about how we approach this. So I follow the member for New Forest East, and he and I have a slightly different view on the way in which the world should be run, and I think he'd be the first to acknowledge that, and ask him and anyone else that proposes this, are they really serious in saying that the most important thing facing Britain is to not just get up to 2% of gross national income to be spent on defence, but in some cases to consider going above that, to insist that every other NATO country does the same, and thus we have a built-in accelerator of arms expenditure in a world that is already a very dangerous place. Cannot we think in terms of some way of solving the world's problems other than more weapons and more wars and more disasters that follow from them? Can we not pursue a serious agenda for peace? I heard on the radio this morning that the US Defence Secretary is very concerned about Britain's position in the world, very concerned that we might be becoming a laggard around the world, and he wants us to boost our expenditure, and presumably they're giving the same message everywhere else, so that they can carry on influencing NATO policies and NATO policies in Europe, while they themselves build up their military might all over the Asia-Pacific region, which in turn encourages China to do exactly the same, just as much as NATO expansion eastwards has been paralleled by Russian increase in expenditure. Surely we need a world that is dedicated towards disarmament, rolling down the security threat rather than increasing it. I just see a huge danger developing in the military thinking that is going on. And when the member for Ilford intervened earlier on the member in his speech and made the point about the strategic defence review that was conducted by Labour, which largely included a foreign policy review, I agree. We don't just need a strategic defence review, we need a serious foreign policy review to appraise ourselves of what our position and status in the world actually is. We once had an empire. We no longer have an empire. It might be news to some of the members opposite that there is no longer an empire, but I can let them know this in the confidence of this chamber, that our influence in the world ought to be for good. It ought to be for peace. It ought to be for human rights. It ought to be for environmental protection. It ought to be for closing the global inequality. Sadly, we might delude ourselves that the rest of the world loves us. They don't. They think we have a predilection to arms, to intervention and to wars, as we did in Afghanistan, as we did in Iraq, as we did in Libya. And if you want to think about what influence in the world is actually about, I just tell you this. Last week, or week before, I was in New York for the last 2 days of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. And it was a desperately sad occasion when Britain and the other permanent members of the Security Council lined up together to protect their expenditure on nuclear weapons, their holding of nuclear weapons, didn't do anything positive to bring about a good resolution of that conference, and no good resolution, frankly, has come out of it, and the possibility of a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone conference, which was first called for more than a decade ago, has still not happened. And because it hasn't happened, there's then an encouragement for proliferation by other very wealthy countries within the region who could afford to buy nuclear technology and develop it. And so, why are we not helpful on this? Why don't we accept that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as the member for Manchester Gorton pointed out, is actually the most supported treaty anywhere in the world? It's a treaty that has reduced the spread of nuclear weapons, not completely eliminated, because India, Pakistan, North Korea and Israel have nuclear weapons outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But those countries that gave up nuclear weapons have some clout in the world. It was very interesting, the respect with which South Africa was listened to at the conference, because they are the most industrialised country that specifically gave up nuclear weapons, and Abdul Minty, their representative there, was treated with enormous respect. He then pointed out that the Humanitarian Effects of War conference held in Vienna, previous ones in Mexico and Norway, had all shown exactly how dangerous nuclear weapons are. So why are we proposing to spend £100 billion replacing the Trident nuclear missile system when we could be doing something far more useful in the world? There isn't much time, Mr. Speaker, so I will be very brief, but there's some other points I just want to quickly mention. I mentioned our intervention and wars in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya. I asked the Foreign Secretary, he's not in his place, but the Foreign Office to reply, when are we actually going to see the Chilcot report coming out? When are we actually going to know the truth of the Iraq war? This is the third Parliament since there was a vote, tragically, to go to war in Iraq. If we don't learn the lessons from Iraq, learn the lessons of the abuse of human rights that have happened in Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya, and also the tragedy of the victims of war, all the wars that have fled, tried to find a place of safety, and the brutal intolerance with which they're greeted in many of the places that they arrive. There is a refugee crisis around the world that we have to address, and address it very, very quickly indeed. And when he was speaking earlier, the member for Manchester Gorton talked about the situation in Palestine. Some of those people dying in the Mediterranean are Palestinians. Some of those people are ones that have managed to get out of Gaza or the West Bank or whatever else. Surely there has to be some serious concern that with all the horrors of everything that's happened in Gaza, and I've been there a number of times, there is still no real rebuilding going on of Gaza. What is that message to young people in Gaza, poor and unemployed, always watching the rest of the world on a television screen or through computers amidst the rubble of their existence? Surely there has to be some real pressure put on Israel to lift the blockade of Gaza, lift the siege of Gaza, and pressure on Egypt to lift the siege of Gaza, so at least the rebuilding can take place and there can be some sort of process there for the future. Two specific cases I want to draw of the Foreign Secretary. I was on an all-party delegation. It was a very strange all-party delegation because it included the members for Halton Price, Sutton Coldfield, Hammersmith and myself to the USA to plead the case of Shaka Amir. And it was with some interest that we were received by Senator John McCain, who realised that there truly was a breadth of agreement on Shaka Amir if the four of us could enter his office, as we did indeed the office of Senator Feinstein and a number of other senators, and make the point that this House of Commons voted with no opposition that we should enable or press for the return of Shaka Amir to this country, who's been here since 2001. He was sold to bounty hunters in 2001. He was brutally treated in Bagram Air Base. He was taken by a rendition process to Guantanamo Bay, and ever since then he's been in Guantanamo Bay and been on hunger strike and protest and many other things. He's never been charged, never been prosecuted, never been through any legal process whatsoever, twice cleared for release by President Bush and later by President Obama, and he's never seen his 13-year-old son, who I had the pleasure of meeting when he came to Parliament, and indeed at a meeting in Battersea last Friday evening, also attended by the member for Battersea, calling for his return and release. Can we have an undertaking of the Foreign Office? They're going to follow up our visit with real vigour and press the Obama administration to name the date by which Shaka Amir will be released and able to come home and join his family in this country. That surely is the very least they could do at the present time. The other case I want to just draw to the attention of the Foreign Office is that of a constituent of mine, Andargachu Sege, an opposition figure from Ethiopia who was kidnapped at Sana Airport in Yemen, was taken to Addis Ababa and has been in prison ever since. He was tried in absentia, sentenced to death, and therefore is on death row in an Ethiopian prison. He could not have been extradited there because of the death penalty anyway. No extradition process was ever sought or followed. He is somebody that is an entirely peaceful person who wants to see peace and democracy and development in Ethiopia, and I know he's been visited by the British ambassador on a couple of occasions. I hope the Foreign Office will be able to inform me that they're making real progress on his release. We live in a time when there are serious issues of human rights abuses all around the world. I've been a member, indeed an officer of the All-Party Human Rights Group ever since I was first elected here. The abuse of human rights is legion all around the world. We all take up many, many cases. If we as a country leave the European Convention on Human Rights, leave the human rights system in Europe, then what message is that to the rest of the world? That we don't care about human rights? We don't think it's important? Where does it give us the power then to prosecute, or to, not to prosecute, to proselytise against human rights abuses or call on countries to improve their human rights record if we're walking away from the international process ourselves? We need a world of peace, not of war. We need a world of human rights and justice, not of injustice and imprisonment. We don't achieve that by greater militarisation. We achieve that by really trying to promote peace, human rights and justice all over the world.